It's always moving for a Russian to obtain the right to delve into his country's archives in search of his history and that of his ancestors. That of my own families in Russia is in these boxes in the basements of the National Archives. The end of our history over there began at the same time as the end of Tsar Nicholas II's on March the 15th, 1917. That was the day the Emperor of all the Russias signed a paper that caused the world to enter a new era. Here's the manifesto of Nicholas II's abdication from the throne of Russia, signed by himself. We do declare for the good of the people our desire to abdicate from the throne of the state of Russia and to give up supreme power over it. Not wishing to separate ourselves from our beloved son, we leave our birthright to our brother, the Grand Duke Mikhail Alexandrovich, and give him our benediction for the ascension to the throne of the state of Russia. A month earlier, the February Revolution, the bourgeois revolution, had shaken the throne. To prevent everything blowing up, the provisional government and army leaders demanded his departure. Two parliamentarians, Shulgin and Guchkov, obtained his signature in pencil at the bottom of this page. When he signed, my great-grandfather was probably not very far away. Prince Vasily Dolgoruki was, at the time, head of the Tsar's military house. The generals, when they incited him to abdication, didn't realize, and neither did he by signing this bill, that the monarchy would disappear as a result. He thought, that's it, I'll abdicate, nothing too serious. No one had had any political experience, so they didn't understand. Abdication constituted a failure in the old manner of governing, a complete breakdown, a crash. Russia and Europe would never be the same again. And the Romanov family, along with my ancestor, began a very long journey on that day, a journey that was to end in bloodshed 17 months later, in the summer of 1918. Before the war, the Russian imperial family had lived in an ivory tower. Nicholas had 4 daughters, Maria, Olga, Tatiana, and Anastasia. His German wife, Alexandra, who was born Alix of Hessen by Rhine, also gave him one son whom he loved, Alexei. A sensitive, fragile child, Alexei was hemophiliac, and Nicholas protected him like the apple of his eye. From the beginning of the century, Russia had grumbled, protested, and from time to time rebelled. A first revolution was thwarted in 1905, and the imperial family thereafter resided in the Alexander Palace in Tsarskoye Selo, 20 kilometers distant from the capital, St. Petersburg. It was a haven of peace, sheltered from all riots and from the gossip and backbiting at court. Just before the war, the little family lived happy, carefree lives in its pretty palace, heavily protected by Cossack troops. They played in the gardens. My forefather, Vasily, with his long moustache, watched over this little world, sheltered from fast-gathering threats.
You know, they were happy together. They were sufficient unto themselves. There was a very small circle that Dolgoruki was part of, a small circle that knew the family very well. They were so very self-sufficient that this withdrawal into themselves led them to no longer pay attention to the people and to the situation. This isolation, this concentration on family, made them indifferent to everything, then made them neglect the situation, made them unaware that he was, in fact, incompetent. It was an infernal spiral.
Nicholas very quickly became the main instrument of his empire's downfall. Distrustful of his ministers and other civil servants, he kept his decisions secret, maintaining the illusion that he alone was in control of everything. He didn't even have a private secretary. This autocratic system was rotting at the root, and Nicholas immersed himself in fantasies. He saw nothing but peasants happy to be working in the fields. He was sure that the people were steeped in respect for the throne, and that a devout church was sacrificing itself for the Orthodox sovereign. He didn't want to see that the vast majority of his 140 million Russian subjects were uneducated peasants. Half-starving, half-enslaved peasants that were, in growing numbers, looking for a way to survive in the city. And that in the new factories, an ill-treated proletariat was growing more and more sensitive to revolutionary ideas. Nicholas was much more concerned with his diplomacy, shaken by the rise in power of Emperor William's Germany. As cousin to King George V of England and friend to President Poincaré, Nicholas chose the Triple Entente of Russia, France, and Great Britain. In 1914, when war broke out, Russia pretended to be ready. She threw 3 million men into battle, but it was an immediate disaster. Nicholas naively thought he would solve the German problem in 2 to 3 months. He thought victory would be easy. But the first big battles and the first big defeats had a sobering effect. And production of quality weapons quickly proved insufficient. Russia was in retreat everywhere. So Nicholas II, to save his country, decided to take command of the army. He then immediately dismissed his uncle, that giant of a general whom his troops adored. It was a bad idea. From that moment on, Nicholas II was directly responsible for the disaster. By early 1917, the army had suffered 1.5 million deaths and 5 million wounded or taken prisoner. Russia had lost a substantial part of its western territory.
Naturally, during the years 1916 to 1917, the population was exhausted by war, totally exhausted. It was interminable. 5 trainloads of wounded arrived in St. Petersburg and in Moscow every day. Every day we had to receive them, care for them. We wanted peace. Peace. Would the war never end?
Behind the lines, there was no time to bury the dead. The army was in retreat. It was no longer even being supplied. The whole country had been bled dry. Both in the cities and in the countryside, people were dying of hunger. In February 1917, the bread riots brought the moderate socialists to power. Lenin and the Bolsheviks were waiting in the wings, organizing revolts and armed battles. When Nicholas II gave the order to open fire on the crowd, people were killed. After that, nothing would ever put a stop to the Russian Revolution. At the beginning of March, the Tsar abdicated in the heart of what had been his headquarters. He wrote,
Wednesday, the last day at Mogilev. At 10 o'clock, I signed my retirement from the army, said goodbye to the staff. With the Cossack officers, my heart nearly broke. The weather was windy, turning to freezing. It was hard and painful.
His whole world was falling into the abyss, but he had only one idea in his head: to join his family again near St. Petersburg. He took once more his beloved blue train. At his side was my faithful ancestor Vasily, who certainly tried to reassure him. The fallen emperor imagined that the provisional government would protect him and ensure that his days ended peacefully. Another mistake. His train was blocked while still on the tracks, 300 kilometers before St. Petersburg, by Soviet rebels, peasants, soldiers, and rebel workers. His real troubles were just beginning. It took 6 days of negotiation before the train was allowed to leave. From that moment on, at the Alexander Palace, nothing was going well. Hated by the Russian people, the German empress, too long under the evil influence of the monk Rasputin, was besieged in her palace. The provisional government dispatched troops, the prestigious Novgorod Guard, to protect the family. But the troubles at the palace gates were multiplying. In that month of March, Alexandra and her children just barely escaped a baleful fate.
In fact, the palace was under siege. Those within were preparing to die, because near this very spot, which was almost the same then as it is today, several hundred soldiers, marginals, drunk or half-drunk, were gathered to attack the imperial family. They were just waiting for the order, but the order was never given.
News of the Tsar's abdication spread very quickly. At the palace gates, the crowd was demanding explanations. March the 21st was the worst of days. The new general-in-chief, mandated by the provisional government, came to Alexandra to inform her that the whole family, including the Tsar, was henceforth under arrest. She wrote,
I listened silently to the general who was still wearing his imperial decorations. He was not in control of what he was saying. God will be his judge.
Revolutionary soldiers took over from the Novgorod Guard. A relative calm returned. The next day, at 4:45, the Tsar's blue train started running again, towards Sakoyet Selo station, the nearest one to the palace. It arrived late in the morning.
They arrived on March 22nd, 1917, at 11:30 in the station of Tsarkoye Selo, where we are now. There was only one colonel to greet the sovereign and his retinue. All those who had accompanied Nicholas on the trip jumped onto the platforms and scurried off like rabbits in all directions. Vasily Dolgoruki was the only one who got down from the train with any dignity with Nicholas. He was the only one who remained by his side to accompany him to Alexander Palace and who would never leave him again.
Both men climbed into a car and headed for Alexander Palace. The Tsar did not yet know what his status was precisely, but the family informed him immediately when he finally arrived. Here, everyone was under arrest, the family and all those with them, including my ancestor Vasily.
In the rooms, nothing much had changed, but the electricity had been cut and the water. They had to walk to warm up. It was the month of March and very cold. They went down and broke the ice on the ponds to have water. There were no supplies left. No one had brought any. They were literally living off tiny portions because there were still a lot of people in the palace. Conditions were exactly like a prison.
The end of winter was rough. The temperature sometimes dropped to -40. They had to ration their pitiful supplies to prevent famine in the family and their reduced entourage. The symbols of the empire were forced to get calloused hands and turn their pretty park into a vegetable patch. Their guards sneered. They were taken from the garrison in St. Petersburg by the provisional government and were undoubtedly already susceptible to the Bolshevik propaganda that was sweeping through the country. Sometimes, too, a remnant of devotion came over them. So they posed beside this once much-dreaded Tsar, henceforth good-natured and endearing. The emperor still under the care of my ancestor Vasily Dolgoruki, his moustaches still a-quiver and his uniform impeccable. By spring, there were only a few faithful followers left at the Alexander Palace, my great-grandfather among them. He is at the top left of this photo. Among those authorized to remain, there were his own mother and her new husband. There was also the tutor to the imperial family and 3 of the Tsarina's lady companions. One of them, Anna Virubova, wrote,
I looked out of the window. In the gardens round the palace was the Emperor of all the Russias with his faithful friend, Prince Dolgoruki. They were surrounded by 6 armed soldiers who pushed the Emperor with their fists, cigarette butts in their mouths, as if he was some kind of a thug. You can't go over there. Come back here. Do as you're told.
Surprisingly, the imperial family lived through it all unflinchingly. Once again, Nicholas II appeared detached from the contingencies of this world. The monarchy had not yet been outlawed. He could have looked for support, revolted, fled. In fact, he resigned himself to all the bullying.
They even forbade Alexandra Fedorovna and Nicholas from communicating with one another. They were forbidden to speak in a foreign language. They could only use Russian. And during their walks, they were always observed. So they tried not to let them be alone. They feared some sort of pact or conspiracy, even though Nicholas and Alexandra had never done anything whatsoever like this. They strictly respected the disciplinary measures that had been imposed upon them.
Beyond the palace gates, where the imperial family discovered what prison conditions felt like, Russia found itself facing 2 major difficulties. Firstly, war continued because Prince Lvov's liberal bourgeois government had made a commitment to the Allies. And then revolutionary unrest. The Soviets, those committees that sprang up everywhere, blocked decisions by the provisional powers. They still had very few members, but they were armed, and their demands were extremely popular. Lenin, in exile in Switzerland, directed the movement from a distance. The Germans were to help him regain a foothold in Russia. They supplied a train to center St. Petersburg with 200 of his followers. The German objective, to foment chaos in Russia in the hope that the Eastern Front would crumble. Lenin did not miss the opportunity. He federated the Bolshevik Party and launched it into the fight for power. A liberal lawyer, Alexander Kerensky, became head of government. He continued with the war. He stood up to the Bolsheviks and decided to protect the Romanovs from the excesses of the people, in case the empire might become a political solution. On July the 31st, the imperial family that was longing to leave for Crimea was evacuated from the Alexander Palace, where it had just spent the last 5 months.
Nicholas had been told that they were being sent to another place without any further detail. He asked for clarifications, but he was just informed to bring warm clothing. So they realized they were not leaving for Livadia in Crimea. But they had another hope, that they were being sent to England.
Exile to England, that would have been a family and political affirmation for the Romanovs. George V, firmly installed in Buckingham Palace, would surely hold out his hand to his dear cousin Nick. Before the war, the two families had seen a lot of each other, like all European monarchies had, entangled as they were in family alliances. Nicholas and George, cousins through the Danish royal family, had enjoyed a very warm correspondence.
They looked so like each other. They looked unbelievably like each other. They cut their moustaches and their beards like each other, so I think they wanted to be like each other.
But the King of England, coldly realistic, was to publicly abandon his cousin, the Tsar.
George V, despite his affection for Nicholas II, didn't want the British monarchy to be associated with a hated foreign despot. And the thing about Nicholas II was he was looked upon all over Europe as the greatest tyrant in charge of a great power.
Of course, he loved playing at we're cousins, we look as alike as twins. But this meant, now, Nicholas, stay at home where you belong and let destiny decide your fate. The provisional government did not, therefore, have a way of discreetly ridding themselves of the Romanov problem. So it decided to evacuate them in total secrecy to Siberia, to a region still relatively untouched by revolutionary movements. Irony of destiny or revenge? Siberia had been for centuries the land of exile for those deported from the Tsarist regime.
They were given little time to get ready. They had no choice but to leave many valuable things here. And the most difficult thing of all was that they would have to cut their ties with St. Petersburg and with this palace at Tsarskoye Selo, because they knew, deep down, that they were leaving forever. That's why the goodbyes were so incredibly tragic. They were allowed to bring a few belongings, and they waited on these chairs until morning, until early morning. Then, in great secrecy, they were led across the park in this direction. They got into cars, and with their few belongings, they were taken to the station.
In her diary, the Empress wrote,
"How painful our departure was. Everything has been put away, the rooms are empty. How painful." In the grey of dawn, a good 30 people were also secretly, or almost, taking the path to interior exile. The Tsar, the Tsarina, their 5 children, their Swiss tutor, 2 doctors, a few servants, among them Val Dolgoruki, faithful among the faithful. They headed for Tobolsk, 2,500 kilometers as the crow flies, but it was more than a week's journey by train and then by boat. For the first time in more than 2 centuries, there was no Tsar in the palace of St. Petersburg. So the new power, which was still bourgeois, scrambled for the leftover riches. As of August the 2nd, the provisional government sent a commission to the Alexander Palace to take an inventory. It included a photographer who would capture for eternity and in color the final splendors of the imperial family. The Alexander Palace was obviously very dear to them. It was where Nicholas and Alexandra had met and where they spent their childhoods. It was their refuge, their enchanted garden, their youth. When they came here, they'd make a date in the children's little house. There's a lovely note about that in Nicholas's diary.
Farewell precious woods, beautiful paintings, and rich textures. The future will be much less luxurious. Here is where they would live henceforth. Tobolsk, still a rather inhospitable destination. In 1917, it was a large town that was inaccessible or practically. There was no station yet, just the river when it wasn't iced over. On August the 4th, the family arrived in Tyumen. There were still boats going up the Irtych. The authorities had requisitioned a steamer to take the family and its retinue to Tobolsk. A rather luxurious boat named the Rus. Undoubtedly the last happy moments of the Romanovs. On August the 6th, they were in Tobolsk. They would spend 8 months there. Val Dolgoruki disembarked and left to reconnoiter with a few other passengers. He couldn't believe what he saw. In the evening, he wrote in his diary,
We arrived in the town at 6 in the evening to see what the governor's house was like and what had been prepared. The general impression was overwhelming. A dirty, dilapidated, stinky house with 13 rooms, a little furniture, but in horrible disorder, and this pestilential odor. The whole thing created a painful impression. We had to go back and suggest to the family to stay a few more days on the boat to give us time to see to the house. We were struck by the authorities' carelessness, such negligence.
There was as yet no intention of harming the imperial family. Tobolsk was simply neglected, poor, and very isolated, far from large cities and the Bolshevik propaganda that destined the empire to public obloquy. In this town, long used to taking in the empire's outlaws, no one had any intention of attacking the Tsar or his family.
В Тобольске как жили, так.
In Tobolsk, people lived like they always had. They hadn't felt any changes in their daily lives. Nobody understood the situation. The powers that be had changed, but what of that? It was God's will. And at the same time, here we have the emperor arriving at Tobolsk with all his family. Several different versions did the rounds. Perhaps the entire government was moving here. You understand, people were imagining things like they often do. We were saying, maybe he's going to move here, or on the contrary, he was going to go home. Nobody knew what to expect. The Romanovs were in town, and that was it. In this late summer 1917, a new routine had fallen into place in the house of the governor of Tobolsk, transformed into an imperial detention center. The Romanovs had left St. Petersburg with a great deal of money and jewelry. So they had the means to restore the house to a respectable state. The meager subsidies of the provisional government would never have sufficed. They always had with them a tutor, a few servants, Val Dolgoruki, 2 doctors, and guards, of course. The family turned in on itself with a few invented occupations.
It's always very moving to look at these photographs, especially the photographs taken here in Tobolsk of members of the imperial family. It's well known that the Tsarevich Alexei Nikolaevich and his tutor Pierre Gilliard took photos. They took a great many. Here's a very interesting one, in which we see Nicholas II seated with his 5 children on the roof of a greenhouse, taking the sun. They were dressed in a way that's not very imperial. Such hats, such scarves. It's difficult to think that these young girls were great princesses, and that they might have become the wives of kings someday.
In Tobolsk today, only ghosts and walls remain. History has once again the freedom of the city in Russia. So the town has reconstituted this house to what it had been in 1918. It is to be a museum.
Nicholas had a table placed here. He read at it and answered his numerous letters. He could look out of the window and see what was happening on the parade ground, which was an important place in Tobolsk. He prayed here, contemplated his country's fate and that of his people. His wife sometimes came to keep him company, sitting on the black leather canopy. And for liturgical celebrations or family moments, they went into the large common room over there. Outside of Nicholas's office, there was an opening onto the balcony. The imperial family went there often. There used to be a French window here. Alexandra Fedorovna, who was ill, walked with great difficulty and used a wheelchair almost all the time. The balcony was accessible for her. On the same floor, there were the princesses' quarters. All 4 girls slept in the same room. Metal bed bases had been installed. There were few wardrobes in the room. Their belongings were placed on chairs. But these young ladies lived in harmony and in happiness.
There were practically no more newspapers, but the Tsar anxiously followed the evolution of events. He had the impression that his country was on the brink of ruin. It was early autumn, and for the first time, he was heard to regret his abdication. This thought would never leave him. On the 7th of November 1917, the die of history had been thrown. The so-called October Revolution had triumphed. The Winter Palace, symbol of a bygone era, had fallen into the hands of the Bolsheviks without a single shot being fired. Everywhere, Soviet workers, peasants, and soldiers held the streets. No one resisted them. Their demands were shared by all: the land to the peasants, the factories to the workers, and above all, peace for all peoples. The political and constitutional projects of the communists were still unclear, but the power of their speech and the strength of their dreams allowed a handful of revolutionaries to shake the world. What does this Soviet power consist of? What are the objectives of this new power? The easiest objective to attain was peace. Lenin simply ordered a unilateral armistice, relinquishing his Entente ties with France and Great Britain. Civil war broke out at the end of September 1917. A separate peace with Germany was vital for the country's new masters, who would need to defend the revolution. For the Romanovs, there would never again be a return to the past. Everything really changed when the Bolsheviks arrived. They removed the guards that had been there, replacing them with men of their own. And these men began to bully the family. The Romanovs were thereafter treated as commoners. Their jailers frequently evoked the family's imminent trial. The family often suffered insults and vexations. Val Dolgoruki was known to have begged the Tsar to remove his epaulettes to prevent incidents with the guards, who'd been given authority by the Soviets. My forefather objected to the guards, who were too familiar with the duchesses. An anguishing boredom descended upon the yard where the royal family was kept. They only had a small courtyard encircled by a high fence so that no one could see them. The children sickened and were frequently ill. Nicholas and Alexandra had lost all heart for anything. There was not much left to eat, and as winter stretched out, their hopes were eclipsed. The nobility and the church, former pillars of Tsarism, had evaporated, and the great European dynasties stopped up their noses and their ears. The children's tutor, still with them, wrote in early April 1918.
We're all in a state of mental anguish. We think we've been forgotten by all. Is it possible that there is no one willing to raise a finger to save the imperial family? Where are those who remained faithful to the Tsar? Why are they waiting so long?
In Moscow, Bolshevik power was under threat. Civil war was raging. The Red Army was undergoing complete reorganization, and Lenin realized that the Romanovs could turn into the standard of the white counter-revolution that was spreading through the whole country, with the support of former allies who'd been betrayed. The adventures of the revolution, the Czech intervention, the beginning of civil war, all this completely changed the course of events. It was Lenin's right-hand man at the time, Lakov Sverdlov, that found the solution to put the Romanovs out of the White Army's reach. He decided to have them transferred to the Urals, to Ekaterinburg. Lenin approved but signed nothing. In early April in Tobolsk, Nicholas was informed that his family was to be moved and he was to be the first to go. Destination unknown. Nicholas didn't want to leave on his own, but he didn't really have the choice. His son couldn't walk, having had a bad fall on the staircase. And clearly the Bolsheviks were firmly determined not to put the whole family in the same train. There were more than 600 kilometers to cover in the chaos of revolution and civil war. Sverdlov's confidence man, Commissaire Yakovlev, organized 2 separate convoys to go to Ekaterinburg, the Red. In the first train, Nicholas wrote,
At 4 o'clock this morning, we said goodbye to our dear children. I was with Yakovlev, Alexandra with Marie, and Val Dolgoruki with Bodkin. The temperature was freezing, and the wind most unpleasant.
And they arrived at Ekaterinburg. They were transferred to the house of shopkeeper Ipatiev, and that was the beginning of another whole story.
Presumably, Ekaterinburg had been chosen because there were already solid Bolshevik detachments there. Ekaterinburg was the center of factories in the Urals, and in these factories, convicts were working. So there were the necessary means for Bolshevik protection. In fact, everything in the town allowed for a sealed incarceration of the imperial family. They arrived on April 30th. They were taken off the train and driven because it had been rumored that a crowd had gathered at the station that wanted to settle accounts with the emperor. Then, the servants who had not left the imperial family arrived. General Dolgoruki also, and with him, Officer Tatichev. But they'd been separated. Dolgoruki and Tatichev had been sent to prison.
To house the family, the Soviets of Ekaterinburg had requisitioned the Ipatiev House in the middle of town. The owner had been promised that he would have it returned very quickly. In other words, the Romanovs would not be staying for long. Even today, no one knows precisely what the intentions of Lenin and the BP were in regards to the family. Hostages? Possible ransom collateral? It was a state secret, eradicated as was the Ipatiev House, which was torn down in the 1960s. 1960s. All that remains are reconstructed models.
'Lenin, 1918. 1918. 1918. 1918. 1918. 1918. 1918. 1918. 1918. 1918. 1918. 1918. 1918. 1918. 1918. 1918. 1918. 1918. 1918. 1918. 1918. 1918. 1918. 1918. 1918. 1918. 1918. 1918. 1918. 1918. 1918. 1918. 1918. 1918. 1918. 1918. 1918. 1918. 1918. 1918. 1918. 1918. 1918. 1918. 1918. 1918. 1918. 1918. 1918. 1918. 1918. 1918. 1918. 1918. 1918. 1918. 1918. 1918. 1918. 1918. 1918. 1918. 1918. 1918. 1918. 1918. 1918. 1918. 1918. 1918. 1918. 1918. 1918. 1918. 1918. 1918. 1918. 1918. 1918. 1918. 1918. 1918. 1918. 1918. 1918. 1918. 1918.
In the beginning of summer 1918, however, it was encircled by a double fence. There were machine guns on the roof and guards everywhere. On April the 30th, the door closed. Nicholas and his meager retinue waited a whole month for the rest of the family to arrive. They also took the train at the end of May. The children, the doctor, the tutor. He had taken photographs of the Romanovs that were still living. They were to be the last. We can see little Anastasia, the Tsarevich, Alexei, and Olga. On May the 23rd, Nicholas II wrote,
This morning, we were told in turn that the children were only a few hours away from town, that they had arrived at the station, and then finally, that they had just been brought to the house. What immense joy it was to see them again and to hold them in my arms after 4 weeks of separation and uncertainty.
The last moments of happiness. Behind these walls, the Tsar and his family would disappear forever from the eyes of the world. The town was totally controlled by well-armed Soviet workers. It was they who supplied the guards for the Ipatiev House. Their leader was a brutal man who only addressed the Tsar when calling him a bloodsucker. Guards and prisoners shared the same floor around the dining room. Nicholas II made himself an office in the living room. The bedrooms had no doors for reasons of security, said the guards. The guards stood behind the chairs as the last of their servants served the Romanovs their meager dinner. The 4 girls slept in the same room, the Crown Prince and his parents in another. They no longer had any privacy.
Nicholas II wrote again in his diary, for example, to go wash or to go to the toilet, you had to pass in front of a guard station. So, in fact, the imperial family was constantly under Bolshevik surveillance.
On the same floor, the commander of the guard enjoyed the comforts of the Ipatiev House. He did not restrain his men when they insulted their prisoners or when they made dirty remarks to the young princesses. The walls were covered in obscene graffiti, and anything that could be stolen had been. The family suffered in silence. Nicholas II wrote little and untidily. He did not complain. He relied on God. He simply missed his friend Val, held prisoner at the other end of the town. Val didn't keep a diary, but wrote many letters that were never posted, like this call for help to his brother.
My dear Paul, I have been arrested and put in prison. I have written a letter asking to be released and to be let go to St. Petersburg to see my sick mother. Tell her that, God willing, I'll see her soon.
In Moscow, those in power were worried. Lenin hassled the brand new Red Army. The promised peace had not lasted. The counter-revolution, both monarchist and republican, was gaining momentum. It was once more chaos, carnage, and terror. White exactions in exchange for red crimes. The English, French, Americans, Greeks, Polish, Romanians, the Japanese, 12 countries intervened. In Siberia, a Czech anti-Bolshevik legion of 45,000 men took Omsk and marched on Ekaterinburg. For the Romanovs, the hope of freedom was reborn. On the 29th of June, Nicholas wrote,
We spent the night on alert, all awake and dressed. The reason for this is that a few days ago we received, in turn, 2 letters in which we were warned to get ready to be abducted by devoted people. But several days having passed uneventfully, we found it was torture waiting like this in uncertainty.
Lenin was not in the least uncertain. It was out of the question that the Tsar, if he were liberated by the Whites, become a symbol of the fight against the Soviets. To his friend Sverdlov, he dictated a telegram to his bodyguard ordering the execution of the whole imperial family. This was transmitted to the Soviets at Ekaterinburg. The Soviet regime would deny until the day it fell that the order had been signed by the founder of the Soviet state. It was summer, and it was heavy in the garden of the Ipatiev House. On July the 12th, Nicholas wrote his last words in his diary.
Alexei took his first bath since Tobolsk. His knee is better, but he can't yet bend it completely. The weather is mild and pleasant. There is no news from the outside.
July the 16th, Alexandra wrote in her diary of an ordinary day, brightened up by a miraculous arrival of fresh eggs and a family card party in the evening.
10:30, we're going to bed. It's 15 degrees.
She prepared the page for the next day, July the 17th. The page stayed blank forever.
We can get a fair idea of that evening by what the Bolsheviks wrote themselves. They don't contradict each other in the main. They said that the imperial family had been woken up and told that they were to be transferred to another place, that they had to get ready and go down to the ground floor.
Jakob Yurovsky, the last commander of the Ipatiev House, convoked them in the stairwell. They were read a death sentence which was immediately carried out by a dozen members of the secret police.
Nicholas II died immediately. He fell at once. Alexandra Fedorovna was killed with 2 gunshots. The girls stayed alive for a very long while as they had jewels, diamonds and other precious stones sewn into their dresses that protected them. As for the Tsarevich Alexei, it was written he suffered a long time.
The Czech Legion arrived too. It was they who filmed the scene of the killings, but none of the victims were found. The murderers loaded the bodies into a truck. Those of the Tsar and his wife, their 5 children, and their last 4 servants. A platoon was ordered to make them disappear. The 11 bodies were dismembered, burned, drenched with acid, and buried in several different spots of this ravishing little forest called the Vale of the Piglet. There was only one official announcement acknowledging that Nicholas had indeed been shot, but also confirming that the family had been evacuated to a safe place. This allowed for the proliferation of a good number of impostors. Copies of this telegraph announcing the execution of the Tsar were posted in the streets. This was the official version until the fall of the USSR. It was not until 1991 that newly elected President Boris Yeltsin gave the orders for searches and investigations to be made. Today, historians are in no doubt. The entire family was executed, and their bodies have since been identified. Today, a cathedral has been built over what had been the Ipatiev House. It has become an important spot for contemporary orthodoxy. We are here to commemorate a great ecclesiastical event. Almost 100 years ago, a terrible crime was committed. The Russian Church considers the Tsar and his family to be saints. From 1917 until the end of the Soviet Union, it had prudently refrained from doing so. The Tsar and his whole family were killed, cut to pieces, tortured to death. Every summer, tens of thousands of pilgrims come to pay homage to these martyrs. On the night of July the 17th, they leave the cathedral on foot and walk to the Vale of the Piglet, 20 kilometers distant. A curious mixture of devotion, nationalism, and bigotry, which also reveals the fascination of some Russians for a strong, centralized power. None of them, in any case, ever lifted a single finger to find Val Dolgoruki. We only know that he'd been killed in a wood a week prior to the massacre in the Villa Ipatiev. But his death still fuels a quarrel among us, his descendants. There are those who consider him a hero because he served his master to the end. And others say, if he had been less stupid, he would have run like a rabbit from the station platform of Sakoye Selo in that spring of 1917. Within our family, this quarrel will never be settled. We do not have the certainties of the new Tsarists. So we are quite simply going to start, among ourselves, another century of family quarrels.